Welcome, listeners, to our inaugural Conscious Collectives podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Hall, and joining me in the studio today is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Syraj Syed, who specializes in educational administration and policy at the University of Florida. And he's become quite an expert behavioral analyst. He's doing some pioneering work around behavioral health integration. So, Dr. Syed, let's start there. What exactly do you mean by behavioral health integration?
We are very narrow-minded in what we think we need to fix in order to be our best selves and our healthy selves and so on and so forth. There are a lot of other unattended to aspects of self that we don't necessarily even acknowledge. There's healthcare, and healthcare primarily occurs in one specific way, which is a very positivist approach to it, which is, hey, you, something's wrong with you. You're broken, you're diminished, you're less than what we consider to be a human being. And, that's kind of a strange way to look at it because it's predicated on some strange but kind of ephemeral, you can't ever really get your hands around what this idealized self should be. It's not even really a self, it's an idealized image of a person or a human being. Who are you supposed to be? How are you the ideal version of yourself? I don't know. You know. It's somewhere buried in your consciousness. And I want to help you to express that, to bring it out so that it can be valued not only to yourself, but to your caregivers. And so my understanding of behavioral health integration is to provide this scaffolding to existing primary care spaces, existing primary care approaches, to scaffold those spaces with this complementary, ancillary, kind of encapsulating way of caring for human beings. And that space, I think, will help us all the traditional healthcare providers, the alternative healthcare providers, these new healthcare providers. To borrow from Hunter Thompson, I almost think of myself as a gonzo healthcare provider. And what this will do is help us all collectively achieve what it is we want to ultimately achieve. And this has been said across varied spaces. We want to achieve whole person care.
Perfect, and I think that frames it nicely for our listeners. So why this and why now?
We're all trying to just kind of figure out a little bit more about ourselves, right? Because we can look around and see plenty that doesn't really work for each of us and all of us. And so let's try to understand a little bit more. And as we explore and we take those first few steps, we discover these others. We discover this kind of substream that is flowing beneath the larger river. And that stream is actually a stream of consciousness. It's the stream of awareness, right? So we tap into that. It's always been there, but we're strengthening it. We're adding to it. We're making it expand, swell. And so I think the time isn't now for this work. I think the time is now for us to join the work.
Okay, and so why this work?
Why this work? Well, there is a history. There's a rich, deep history of what I call consciousness work, because that's ultimately what any of this is. Any introspection, any esoteric kind of inward thinking, it's all part of consciousness work. What I found that I'm good at is building the pathways to the inner self.
Mm-hmm. All right. And I know this is important to you. Tell me about the method.
I exist somewhere between the space of the scholar and the space of the shaman. So it's, again, the middle space. That's where I live. And so I want to do the shamanic work, but I want to validate it through scholarship. And whenever I am, in fact, working with someone, I am with them, and it tears at me, and it tears, and it rips, and it shreds. But that's when I realize it's because I think I've learned that I'm strong enough to occupy that space. And I will bleed with you, and I will die with you, but don't worry, I've got the way back. I know how to do it. And so let me help. And when you come back from that first death of ego and death of former self, then there will be a new power that you have to perhaps choose to also join the work.
As I've understood you, the core expression of this work is intentionally pulling out an individual's authentic self, discovering or helping them to discover their own narrative. Describe the person who may benefit from this type of engagement with you.
I dig to find life. My work is to learn about yourself. I work with people who are broken, so I'm going to help those people because they're really having a very, very difficult time of it. I don't care who you are. I don't care how successful you are. I don't care what you have done. Everyone seeks this transcendent moment.
And sure, and so in your experience working with people, what do you think has caused them to forget themselves?
I mean, we are in spaces where choices are made for us. And as those choices are made for us, they're often made very poorly. And when I say poorly, I don't necessarily mean that they're made without good intention. So it's not just blame the parents, blame the people who raised us, blame them, and that's the problem. No, they're made poorly because they're not made with an understanding of who that child is. People don't really take that time. Many do, many more don't. And so when those poor choices are made for us, we labor within those constructs, those created realities. You're supposed to be a doctor. You will follow the beliefs of this family, or you're going to be out. And that's the worst kind of terrible threat to make to a member of this species. No one wants that isolation, so they choose to continue to labor within these poorly constructed realities. And then what starts to happen is you just keep doing what you think is supposed to be done so that you can continue to be accepted and you can continue to fit, and then you can continue to feel normal or how someone should be. And then you start to forget. You start to forget the musician. You start to forget the healer. You start to forget the person that you are, and you start to believe you're this other person that you're supposed to be. That is the process of self-forgetting. That's how we forget who we are. I'm saying that all this self-forgetting and all these actions and decisions and choices made toward trying to be something that has been kind of externally defined for you, it doesn't lead to brokenness as much as it leads to fragmentation. So you just are these million little black pieces of self, and the process is about identifying where all those pieces are. Again, this weird excavation like image that comes in and pulling those pieces together, and then doing the incredibly difficult work of putting that massive jigsaw puzzle back together.
Okay, so walk me through the process of engaging an individual. I know it's customized to a certain degree by the individual or individuals that you're working with, but kind of walk us through how you actually engage with these people.
It begins with the individual I'm sitting with, and it could be a group of people, group of individuals. It can work in that way as well, but if we just think of the person, where all this is beginning is with a recognition from me that there is dissonance, cognitive dissonance emerging, oozing out of this person. They are itching with dissonance, and it's not necessarily discomfort. I mean, in one sense, a certain kind of person can appear in front of me, and that person can have everything going right, quote unquote, in their lives relative to whatever sociocultural model they're subscribing to at that moment, but they're just feeling that itch they can't scratch. And that itch, that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance is the beginning of this work. When that dissonance is realized, then the process enters into a mode of reflection, right? So I'm just, in that moment, a mirror. I'm just reflecting back to the person, but in a way that is promoting kind of a deeper dive, a deeper consideration. And often that deeper dive is kind of requiring the person to actually, well, as the phrasing that we've valued for some time is, it requires that person to turn into the skid, right? To lean into that dissonance. Don't go, and this has become kind of a more favorite phrase of mine, don't go where you want to go. Go where you don't want to go. Go where you're afraid to go, because where your fear manifests in front of you, it is behind that fear that your greatest gain can be made. So that's the next step in the process. And following that is a whole lot of complex methodological application.
So elaborate on that a little bit for me. Are we talking about writing exercises? Describe that process a little bit.
I mean, the writing isn't necessarily for everyone, but some form of written expression, I believe, is essential, because there's a power in putting something in writing. It is then materialized. It is your darkest fear that has just gripped you so tightly from within, and you're taking it and you're putting it out there somewhere. You're putting it in front of you on this page, and then you can step back from it and you can look at it, and now you can examine it and you can dissect it. You can toy with it. You can do whatever you want, because you've empowered yourself to put it out there. And so once it's out, then you are a little bit more free to enact some kind of empowerment. You can choose to look at it, and it may increase your fear. It may say, I mean, that may require you or lead you to say in that moment, wow, I never even thought of this, or I never saw it that way, and I am just paralyzed. I don't know what to do. Or you may look at it and say, I never thought about it that way. I can't believe I've been like this. I can't believe this is how I've been living. And then you're angry. And that anger can also be then expressed in a very unhealthy way, or unproductive way, at the very least. Or you can channel it into something that is further empowering. That is what the writing can do. I think prior to that written expression, that is a very big step for many individuals, but I think it's significant for every individual. But prior to that, there has to be kind of a very well orchestrated engagement. And that engagement is kind of a dance. It's a dance that the individual often doesn't know the steps to. So we just start slow. All right? Just a 1-2 kind of cadence. Very simple, very easy. And what you're doing at that point as a practitioner of this method is you are helping that individual to gain an awareness of what the process is, what all the movements are, and helping them to kind of learn kinesthetic, cerebral, intellectual, spatial vocabulary to just kind of move into a space where they can actually express a little bit more, feel a little bit more sure-footed in a space in which they're starting to turn within, turn inward. Because if you just kind of rip off the Band-Aid and they enter into that space, it can be terrifying. It's been terrifying for me at times. And, those were moments I didn't necessarily have a kind of a guide or an awareness of what this process was supposed to be. So I kind of learned about this through a lot of stumbling. But there were also great resources. So the writing is really good. The dialectic, the discourse, the exchange is very important. But ultimately, one can come to a place where that individual is then very empowered to choose their own path of self-expression. Everyone must at some point. And who knows what those paths can be. I certainly don't know every path. So I work with what I know, and part of the method then is this vocal exchange and kind of a written component, which can then be used, analyzed, used as a mechanism, as a tool to help build more tools for the individual. But those other tools that they then choose to employ could have nothing to do with me. When that moment occurs, it's a beautiful moment, because then that person just goes. And then we've just added a little bit more power to that flowing substream that is developing force and momentum beneath this heavy river of society and culture that we're, kind of in.
And so how do you know that this is working for somebody? What is the evidence that you can derive from the individual through this engagement that lets you know and lets them know that they're on a trajectory, if you will, toward progress?
Everything's a process, and that is what I repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat to clients, to patients, to people, to friends, to family. It is a process, and yet there are discernible gains along the way. And those ways of understanding those gains are sourced within certain concepts like self-efficacy, self-authorship, self-determination, self-actualization. So obviously the common theme to all those models is self. So the first way to understand progress is to understand that you are, as an individual, starting to understand this space of self, this dividing of your attention between this is me and this is that. This is the person that I am because I'm striving to do the things that my family have always valued throughout generation upon generation as the kind of good person one can be. But over here, this is me saying, I'm not sure that I maintain or agree with or choose to adopt those values, or perhaps all of those values. Maybe I value some of those values. And so I am going to now choose to examine all of those values, evaluate them from this frame I've now found, which is this me, this I, that is seemingly undefined by concepts and ways of living that I can now recognize have come from mom, professor, job, community. This is just me. As I then choose to move from self-evaluation to implementation of certain ways that resonate with myself, my I, my me, then I am self-authoring, I am being self-deterministic, and I am on the road to self-actualization. Self-actualization is the operationalization of my remembering myself. Like, oh, right, I'm me, I'm this. And now I'm going to act that out. I'm going to enact this self. It may be something dramatically different from what everyone else has known, or, as is often the case, I've found, it's a self that you emerge as, and the people around you that have always been around you, some, maybe many of them will come to you and say, I always saw you to be this. I don't know, it was something. I just recognized it when you were like 10 and you did X. And yeah, of course, because that is when that self emerged. Maybe there was a little hole in the created reality, a little moment, a little space, a little, stopover, a little suspension of that particular momentum, and that self emerged. Man, he really loved music and he was always playing this, or he really loved engaging in this activity over here. He always used to just dress up like a little news reporter and loved giving updates to the family. He was only 7, Right. So, maybe some of the people around us in that moment could have helped us along with exploring that pathway. But if the values didn't jive with what those existing values in that particular space at that time were, then that exploration was probably squelched.
And so for people listening to this, they may just say, this sounds like another form of mental health counseling or behavioral health counseling or even psychotherapy. What makes this different?
There's so many different approaches. There's approaches that I value highly. There's approaches I've practiced as a patient myself. There are approaches that have worked well for me. There's approaches that I have internalized and borrowed from. And then there is my own academic training, which is as an interpretivist, a phenomenologist, a qualitative methodologist, a shaman. My sensibilities trend toward the space of exploring someone's narrative, exploring someone's story. That is predicated on the belief that everything that needs to be utilized to aid in this individual's emergence as authentic self is to be found in that person. It doesn't exist outside of the person. The approach begins as co-constructivist. It is a space in which I am very much involved, but I'm also not there. I practice a lot of different and varied disciplines in order to maintain my non-being in that space. I am a mirror. I am a guide. I am a vehicle. I am a mechanism. I'm a tool. Ultimately, I can also be thoroughly unnecessary if people spontaneously choose to engage themselves. It's not really a process of distinguishing. It's a process of, again, integrating. It's a process of complementing, of supporting, of exchange, of co-locating around someone and wherever they are. So it is a multimodal approach to self-actualize as a human being.
Excellent. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion with you, Dr. Syed, about behavioral health integration, what it is, and the method you use to engage people to help them discover or even rediscover themselves. I'd like to thank our listeners, and especially you, Dr. Syed, for your time today. You can find this podcast and others like it at Dr. Syed's site, which is conscious-collectives.com. And on that site, you can find information about how to contact Dr. Syed and work with him directly. Again, my name is Garrett Hall, and I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in today. We look forward to engaging you again soon.